Does your company have a good wellness program? See how it stacks up against the healthiest employers of Indiana and across the country. Visit us online at healthiestemployers.com to join the community and start your application today.
Pacers still need some help. Oh, he threw it away. Reggie for three. Boom, baby. It's a tie ball game. Unbelievable. Across the timeline with four. Down the right side, and he fell down. No whistle. And that's it. They win it. Can you believe it? They have stolen game one.
From Reggie Miller's heroics in game one to that dramatic finish in game seven.
Harper to get it in. Throws it to Ewing. Ewing surrounded. 2 seconds to shoot. He drives. He shoots. He missed. He missed. He missed. We ring the bell, baby. Ding dong. The witch is dead.
Mark Boyle's unforgettable call of the Pacers Knicks 1995 Eastern Conference semifinals. Fans still recall, ding dong, the witch is dead. But he wanted to reel it in the second it came out of his mouth. If that was one of Boyle's regrets behind the mic, this was perhaps his biggest joy, working side by side with the late, great Hoosier legend Bobby Slick Leonard.
It was a delight and a privilege to be in his orbit.
Gets it to Reggie for three. Unbelievable! Here's a three. Yeah! Boom, baby!
27 of Mark Boyle's more than 30 years calling the shots for the Indiana Pacers spent with Slick Leonard. Get to know the man from Minnesota who found his voice broadcasting high school football games in a wooden press box in Miles City, Montana, honed his skills in the NHL, NFL, and Major League Baseball before eventually winding up as the voice of the Indiana Pacers. We're tipping off with Mark Boyle on this edition of the Business and Beyond podcast. Hello and welcome to the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. I'm Gary Dick. As a young boy, Mark Boyle thought he'd become a professional baseball player, a catcher. Not in the cards. Coach? Not enough patience. Attorney? Well, he didn't want to go to school that long. But Boyle had a bug for broadcasting and figured he'd teach himself how to do it. And he did just that. He took a job driving a forklift and in his spare time, took his tape recorder to high school gyms and baseball fields and called games. He's come a long way since then, 34 years with the Pacers, a franchise record, a man of eclectic interests, including chess, performing with the symphony, and piranha fishing on the Amazon. I'm pleased to be joined by the voice of the Indiana Pacers, Mark Boyle. And Mark, it's great to be with you. Really looking forward to this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, first question I have to ask you, this is kind of the summer off season for the NBA, including the broadcast team. Are you doing anything crazy this summer? Because typically you will do some pretty interesting things.
Well, I would take exception to the descriptive term crazy. That's all very subjective. I consider that to be more interesting or eclectic. But I hear where you're going. And I will get back to that. I've done a lot of different things over the years. The Pacers have been very kind and supportive in that regard. But with COVID, I just didn't know how much I could plan. So I didn't plan to do anything. But I'm hopeful that by the time we get a few months down the road, things will start to trend in a positive direction again. And then I can maybe come up with something for next summer.
Okay. You called minor league baseball. Was that in out east or was that out west? Where was that?
That was out in Billings, Montana. I took the summer of 2005. I got into it, Gary, to do baseball, but my opportunities came in other directions, and so I never got to do baseball. I've done a handful of AAA games here and there with the Indians and with the Buffalo team out in the eastern part of the country, but I'd never gotten a chance to do it every day, and I always wanted to. So I went out to Billings, Montana, which was rookie ball, which doesn't even exist anymore with the way Major League Baseball has recalibrated the minor leagues. But it fit into my schedule. They started in late June. They played until Labor Day. And so I did 76 games in 80 days. And it was a wide-flung experience.
Wow.
The Pioneer League is no longer in existence. But In those days, I'm pretty sure it was the furthest reaching minor league in the country. Our closest opponent was 400 miles away. Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, where
Holy
these teams
cow.
were all located, are wide open spaces, and the towns are few and far between. So it was a summer doing baseball virtually every night. It was a summer on buses. It was a summer in, I wouldn't say flea bags, but not quite the caliber of hotels we're used to in the NBA. And I'll tell you this, now that's 16 years ago, and I still look at that as one of the best summers I've ever had in my life.
Interesting. Did you take I think I heard an interview with you on the radio. Did you take a bus out there to Montana to start that job?
No, I took a bus out to Montana to start my career. When I was a young man, I talked my way into a job out in Miles City, Montana, where a friend of mine had been working. He left to go to, I think it was Nebraska. So the job was opened. It paid $500 a month. It was like 60 hours a week. I'd never lived in a small town. There was nothing to do, but it was a job. And so I sent a tape out there, and the guy liked it. So I sold everything I had that couldn't fit into like 3 giant boxes, and I shipped them out. And then I sold my car and got on the Greyhound, and that's how I started.
Wow. And it should have been a natural for you to go into broadcasting because your dad was a broadcaster, right?
Correct. My dad worked in broadcasting for a long time. And by the time I was old enough to recognize what he was doing, he was pretty much anchored down in Minneapolis. He would eventually do the Twins on television, the old Minnesota North Stars. He did the high school hockey tournaments on television. Later on, he moved on to ESPN. But when I was growing up, he was a local sports anchor. In those days, whichever television station owned the rights. Now, keep in mind that these were the days where not everything was on television. So there might have been 45 out of 162 on TV, and whoever had the games used their own people to do them. You didn't work for the teams or a regional sports network. So my dad worked for Channel 11, which was an independent television station in Minneapolis. And he was the nightly sports anchor, and then he did the games. And that's what I grew up watching. And my dad was a really interesting guy. He was a no-nonsense guy. And so when I expressed interest, Gary, in going into it, he was supportive, but he made sure that I knew you were likely not to make any money. It was a very difficult job in terms of establishing a family. You were gone at night. You would miss your kids' stuff. There were a lot of downside to it that not many people knew about if they weren't in the business. My dad was very frank about that. And the one thing he told me is the one thing I tell kids today. Don't get into it. Don't get into it for the wrong reasons. And there's only one good reason to get into it, and it's this. You got a passion for it. And I mentioned that job in Miles City. I made $500 a month. And do I want to go back there? No, I do not. But I can tell you with a straight face, I like that job every bit as much as I like this job. And that's how I know I had a passion for broadcasting.
That is a great story. So what was your big break? You got back to Minnesota. I mean, you've worked at some great stations, KSTP, and in radio, The Fan, in New York, KMOX. What was your big break that I guess got you back to Minnesota, right?
Well, I was working in a town about an hour north of Minnesota. It was my 4th job. And we were an affiliate on the Minnesota North Stars Hockey Network. And this is a story I also tell kids because it illustrates something that I consider to be very important, and that's this. Never underestimate the impact of what you're doing. If one person is listening or 1 million people are listening, you don't know who that one guy is or who in that million might be listening. And the reason I mention that is because we were an affiliate, and the sports director of the flagship in Minneapolis called me and said, hey, listen, we got 80 games. I got 2 intermissions to fill every night. That's 160. I need stuff. I'm calling around and asking guys who work for our affiliates if they'd like to do a feature for us. And man, I was busy, Gary. I was doing games every night. I was doing morning drive. I was young, but still, it was wearying. And I could have just mailed it in, but I did the best job I could on that feature. I gave them a 3.5-minute feature. I sent it, and they used it. Then about May, the general manager of the station called me and said, hey, listen, my guy, who was the guy that called me, Russ Small was his name. He went to Houston. My guy's leaving. I got an opening. I heard that thing you did for our intermission. I want you to come down to me and talk about the job. The guy's name was Scott Meyer. He hired me in Minneapolis, my first major market job. He then became the first general manager of the first all sports station in the country, WFAN in New York, which was owned at the time by Jeff Smulyan of Smulyan Communications. And he brought me with him. So if I had half-assed that feature or not done it at all, I like to think that I'm talented enough to still been successful, but maybe not. A lot of guys with talent don't succeed because they don't get the breaks. But because I did a feature the best I could and sent it in, and he heard it and liked it, he gave me my 2 best jobs that got me started. And in large part because of him, I'm where I am now.
That is a great story, and we should send it to every aspiring broadcaster in the country. It's a really, really good story. Mark, so your path then, as I mentioned, you did spend time at the Fan in New York, ended up at KMOX before you came here. What was that? What was the stops between Minnesota and your time here at the Pacers? What transpired there? What got you to Indianapolis?
Well, I started in 78 and I got here in 88, so not quite 10 years. And in those 10 years, I worked in Miles City, Montana, Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, Dubuque, Iowa, St. Cloud, Minnesota, Minneapolis, New York, and St. Louis. That's 8 stops. And that's another thing about this business. Unless you're really lucky, it's pretty transient. You got to make a few jumps to get to where you want to go, and you got to be willing to pack up and move, at least in most cases. So that was my path. And when I got here, I laugh about it now. I'd already worked in New York. I'd done talk shows in Minneapolis, St. Louis, New York. I had a smattering of big market experience. Indianapolis was a very small market, which by NBA standards it still is. And although I don't know this for certain, I'm pretty sure when I took this job, I was the lowest paid guy in the NBA. So I thought, well, it's an NBA job. Yeah. Slick used to say this. It's easier to switch seats on the bus than it is to get on the bus. I was on the bus. So I was hopeful that I could switch seats and get to a bigger, better job. I signed a 2-year contract. And here's where good fortune comes in. When you're starting out and you're young and you don't really know much, you think all these major league jobs are the same. They aren't. The work might be the same, but the rest of it, the thing that makes the job so much more enjoyable is the environment and the circumstances. And I wasn't here very long before I realized I might be able to find something bigger, but I am not going to be able to find something better. The Simons have owned the team since I've been here. They're the longest running NBA owners, closing in on 40 years now. It's a great place to work from the ownership on down. They give you space to do the job. They're very supportive. I could have gone, and I've had opportunities to leave. I could have gone to bigger markets, but I could never have found a better job than this. And so now, these many years later, I'm still here.
How did the opportunity come up with the Pacers? I think you maybe were at KMOX at the time in St. Louis. How did somebody call you? Did you go out looking? How did it come about?
Well, going to KMOX was the biggest mistake I ever made in my career. I had grown up as a boy in Minneapolis, and there was a 50,000 watt radio station. I could hear it at night, and they had guys like Bob Costas and Henry Carey and Jack Buck, and it was the premier sports station in the country in the days before there was all sports radio. They had the Cardinals and the Blues, and they did everything. They were CBS owned and operated. They had extraordinary ratings, and I was just captivated. I'd always wanted to work there. And when I was in New York, one of our producers had worked there, and he had inside information, and he told me, you know what, there's going to be an opening there. You should send him some stuff. So I did. And they were so circumspect in their methodology there. They actually flew me in there twice to audition. And so I did a couple of talk shows for them.
Wow.
And I knew at the time it was a poor fit. My style was totally opposite of what they do. They were very laid back and conservative, and they did caller intense talk shows where the caller asked a question, you answered it, moved on to the next caller. That ain't my thing. I like to have fun. I like to be irreverent. And I knew I wasn't a good fit there, but I went anyway because I'd always wanted to go. Well, I didn't have a contract there. And so a little while in, I saw that it wasn't going to be a fit. And they didn't fire people there. What they did if they didn't like you was give you a circumstance under which you'd leave on your own. And they put me on the overnights. So
right. Yeah.
I started to call around and I heard the Dallas Mavericks were looking for a guy. So I called Dallas and they told me, we were looking, our number 2 guy, Ted Davis, went to Indiana. But our number 1 guy left. I think he went to Miami. Anyway, the number 1 job was open. Ted got out of his Pacers contract. He went back to Dallas. And here's where timing comes into play. So I called them. Now, this is maybe a month before training camp starts. They're in a bit of a bind. They have a timing issue there. So I called them. I sent them my stuff. They liked it. They flew me in. They interviewed me. I took that job. I might be a little hazy on the details. It's so long ago. I think there was less than a week to go before training camp started. So I took that job.
Wow.
And timing. if they had had the whole summer to look for a guy, they might have looked longer and harder and found somebody with more experience or somebody that they thought might be able to do a better job. But they were in a bind. And a lot of the established guys were already locked in for the coming season. So I was, I think, the beneficiary of good circumstances, a lucky break, and they hired me.
Wow. Now, when you got here, you're a young guy on the move. Were you looking at this job initially as maybe a kind of a, another stop on another rung on the ladder moving up? I'm sure you didn't have any anticipation of staying here for 3 decades. You were a young guy on the move.
Yeah. And as I said before, I planned to stay for 2 years. That was my first contract. I actually took a pay cut to come here. I was making, I think, $45,000 in St. Louis. This was 1988. And they offered me 40. And, I'm not in a great position to negotiate here. I want the job. And they're not really in a great position either because the clock's ticking. And so the way they offered me a 1-year deal for $40,000. So the compromise was, I'll take your 40, but you got to give me 2 years because you've run like 4 guys or 5 guys through here in the last 4 or 5 years. You seem a bit fickle to me. And so I'll take your 40, but you got to give me 2. And they were fine with that. And we went from there.
What did you remember about those early years with the Pacers? As you said, you quickly learned this was a special place in Indianapolis. What were those first few years like behind the mic for the Pacers?
Well, they were exciting for me because it was my first. I had done some NHL and I had done some Big Ten stuff, but I wanted to get to the major leagues. And with all due respect to the Big Ten or the SEC, that to me wasn't the major leagues. Those were great jobs, and I was lucky to have them. But I wanted to be in the NHL, the NBA, or Major League Baseball. And so I was so excited to have the job. Now, the first year I was here, the Pacers started 0-9 and wound up winning 28 games. And to this day, that's the worst season they've had since I got here. So we missed the playoffs the first year, and then they started making the playoffs every year, but getting bounced out in the first round. They lost to Boston twice. They lost to Detroit. They just couldn't get out of the first round. But my own circumstance was great. I had full support from management. When I took this job, the one concern I had, I'd never worked for a team before. I'd only worked for radio stations. When you work for stations, there's a partnership there, but you have a little bit more flexibility. And I was really concerned because to this day, Gary, I consider my credibility to be my number one asset. And I did not want to give that up. And some franchises demand that you do, especially now. It wasn't as prevalent back then where they wanted it to be us against the world, but it was still around. So Donnie Walsh was in charge in those days, and I told him, hey, I want this job, but I have a concern. And I told him what I just told you, and he told me, I don't care what you say, as long as it's fair and you don't get personal. And that's the philosophy that they've stuck with over the years. So they allow me to keep my credibility. And now, as you might expect, I don't know how many people know this, but most basketball franchises are divided into 2, not camps, they work together, but 2 separate sides of the street. There's the basketball side and the marketing side. I have never, ever had a problem with the basketball side. Every once in a while, marketing would bristle at something, I would say, because they're trying, to sell stuff. And by the way, when I say marketing, Rick Fusen's in charge and has been for a long time. And he and I have butted heads from time to time. But he's been very respectful of what I'm trying to do, and I'm very respectful of his authority. We get along well. But inevitably, because we see the world differently, we're going to clash. And so we've had minor headbutts over the years. But the way I tried to sell it to him back in the day is this. Let's say some guy's driving around in his car listening to a game, and he hears me raving about how well the Pacers are playing. I want that guy to say, or gal, hey, Mark is really excited about this team. I don't get that from him all the time. Maybe I should go buy a ticket. Instead of Mark's really excited about this team, but I remember he was the same when they were 28 and 54. So his words don't reverberate with me.
Yeah, right.
I think they get that. They must get that. They've let me do it the way I want to do it. And don't misunderstand. I'm not looking to criticize anyone. I'm looking to be honest and candid. I want the Pacers to win. If the franchise does well, it benefits me. From a selfish standpoint, I want them to win. And then when you're around the team every day, you start to develop relationships and you like the guys and you want them to succeed. I've always wanted them to win. But once that microphone is live, in my view, I work for the fans, not the team. And I want the fans to trust and believe in me. And believe me, especially now, it's getting worse or better, depending on how you look at it. But from my perspective, it's worse. More and more teams are demanding homerism and, boosterism. I can't do that. And at this stage of my career, if they ask me to do it, I'm old enough now that I just say, you know what, now I'm going to sit in my back porch and smoke cigars. But when I was young, they could have said, hey, we want you to do it differently. And I would have either had to do it or find a different job. That's one of the reasons I've stayed here.
Yep. And it has been a formula for success without question. We'll have much more with Mark Boyle. When we return, we'll touch base on his 30-year career with the Pacers, the Malice at the Palace, which Mark literally witnessed up close and personal. Also his special relationship with Slick Leonard. That and much more when the Business and Beyond podcast returns.
The Healthiest Employers Award program is now open to companies of all sizes in the state of Indiana. We have created a community of wellness leaders from across the country dedicated to cultivating a more proactive approach to employee health and well-being. To nominate your organization, visit us online at healthiestemployers.com. Healthiest Employers, the nation's leading corporate well-being award.
Welcome back to the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. My guest this week is the voice of the Indiana Pacers, Mark Boyle. And Mark, you've had so many memorable calls that Pacer fans remember in your 3+ decades with the team. But this has to be one of the most memorable.
Harper to get it in. Throws it to Ewing. Ewing surrounded. 2 seconds to shoot. He drives. He shoots. He missed. He missed. He missed. We ring the bell, baby. Ding dong. The witch is dead.
Okay, Mark, 95 Eastern Conference semifinals. Patrick Ewing, the miss, the Pacers on to the conference finals. I can remember it. Where I was with a bunch of a big group of people and how exciting it was, not only, as a sports event, but the city came together. That call to me was iconic, but you didn't necessarily like it. Is that right?
I would go a step further. I actually hated it. and here's why. I'm a big believer in spontaneity. I don't have catchphrases. I'm not denigrating those that do. It's just not my thing. I don't have catchphrases. I try to react spontaneously. But as that series wore along, that was the third straight year they played in the playoffs. The Knicks took the Pacers out in the first round 2 years before. The year before that, they took them out in Game 7 of the conference finals. The Knicks were just this albatross the Pacers couldn't shake. And so I got to thinking about it, and I thought, it's sort of like Dorothy and the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wizard of Oz. If I get a chance, I'm going to throw that in. And so we get to that last possession, and, Ewing gets the ball, and he comes right down the middle of the lane, and it looked like he was going to score for sure. And then he missed the shot, and Dale Davis rebounded, and that's what came out of my mouth. And I'll tell you this, as soon as it did, had it been one of those cartoon balloons, I would have reached out and pulled it back in. But it was too late. And that's one of the things that separates us from print media. If we make a mistake, we don't get to correct it. If I make a mistake writing a newspaper article, I can change it or somebody else will. That's one of the differences in the two mediums. And as soon as that left my mouth, I thought, oh man, I'm never going to live this down. Never. It's going to hang with me like fungus for the rest of my life. And I've gone from being amazed that people liked it to being grateful that they did, because I still hear about it. Oh, I remember that call in 90. That's 26 years ago, and people are still mentioning that to me. Can you imagine if they were mentioning it to me because they hated it? First of all, people that don't like you or think they say it on Twitter. They don't come up to you in person.
Good point.
So it probably wouldn't happen all that often. And I am so grateful because when I thought about it, I thought it would be cool. But then when I said it, and I've heard it now 100 times, and I don't think it's that bad. I think the reason I don't like it is because it's just not how I do things. And it worked out for me, but it was not, at the time, I thought it was not my finest moment.
Yeah. What, and this is always such a, unfair question. You asked for your favorite call. You've had so many moments. Reggie in the Garden against the Knicks, the 8 points in whatever it was, less than 10 seconds. Do you have a favorite call or a couple of calls that really, as you look back on your career, you think about?
I have one that I really liked, and I thought I nailed it, and I bet you most people don't even remember. It was in the Chicago Pacers Eastern Conference Finals. I think it was game 6. Yeah, it had to be game 6. They had the ball. If you'll remember that series, the Bulls won it in 7. The first 6 games, in fact, all the games went to the home team. And the 3 games in Chicago were just one-sided. But the 3 games in Indianapolis were very close, went down to the final possessions. And in this game, they tried to post Jordan up on Derek McKee. And Derek poked the ball away. And while it was rolling out toward the perimeter before anyone could get it, time expired. And the way I called that was, as Derek poked it away, instead of saying McKee pokes it away and the Pacers pick it up, I don't even remember who picked it up, but time expired. And the way I called it was, McKee pokes it away. Can you say game 7? And I thought that was so cool. And I bet you if you went down the street and asked 100 people, none of them would remember. But I do. It's my favorite.
Yeah. That is good. That is good. You think back to those rivalries, the Knicks, the Magic, the Bulls, the Pistons. I mean, those were some intense rivalries back in the day. Is there one that was more intense or more heated than any of the others, or were they all kind of equal?
Well, I think you'd have to get an accurate answer there. I think you'd have to ask the people that were involved. We were on the periphery. We were chronically. But we had interaction with the players and coaches, so I think I had a feel for it. But to definitively answer, you'd have to go to a player or coach. From my perspective, I think those Knicks games of the 90s were probably the fiercest. The game was different then. More physical play was allowed.
Oh, yeah.
It seemed like something was always on the line. I mean, watch some of those old Knicks Pacers games from the mid-90s. Half the players from both teams would have been thrown out for flagrant fouls in today's game. And I'm exaggerating a bit. Gary, the thing that always amused me about that rivalry, and it really gets to the heart of why we're able to do what we do for a living, without the passion of the fans, on occasion, the irrationality of the fans, their loyalty, we wouldn't have jobs because this wouldn't be something that would generate business. But I look back to those times, and the reason I mention that is this. You could have switched uniforms and not been able to tell which team was which. They both played the same way. They were fierce. They were really physical. They were aggressive. But our fans thought they were thugs, and their fans thought we were thugs. You're looking at your own team in the mirror here, and you don't even see it. And that's one of the great things about fandom.
Yeah.
They don't look at things rationally. And the other thing that was ironic about those days was, remember, at some point in that process, the media dubbed it Hicks versus Knicks. We were the Hicks, they were the Knicks.
Oh, yeah, right.
And the irony was, we had way more people from New York on our team than they did. Donnie Walsh was from New York. Mark Jackson was from New York. Sam Perkins was from New York. Jamal Tinsley was from New York. And the list goes on. We had way more New York presence on our team than they did, but it was still Hicks versus Knicks.
That is interesting. Yeah. Malice at the Palace, back in the headlines with the documentary that recently came out. November 2004, Pacers Pistons. You had a front row seat, of course. But what I didn't know until I was doing a little research for this, you actually got some broken bones out of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Ron Artest plowed you over when that thing talk about how that all transpired.
Well, I think most people know the background. It was an early season game in Detroit, Pacers and Pistons. A year before, Pistons took the Pacers out in the conference finals. It looked like they were the 2 best teams in the East again. And so this was the first meeting since. And it was in Detroit, and the Pacers were dominating. They were up 15 or 17 in the final minute. And then Ron and Ben Wallace got into it. And people have seen this video 1,000 times. So fast forward now, as the thing unfolds, we're sitting courtside, and Ronnie lays down on the table right in front of us. I could have reached out and touched him. And he puts a headset on. A lot of people thought we were talking to him, but we knew Ronnie well enough by then to know not to open a mic around him unless the circumstances were a little more favorable. So he had the headset on, but it wasn't live. And then eventually, as everybody saw, the guy threw the cup of beer. And when Ronnie jumped up, I instinctively jumped up and tried to stop him, and I wrapped my arms around him, and he just steamrolled me. And the floor was cement, and I landed hard on my back, and I ended with 5 fractured vertebrae. I haven't seen Ronnie now for a long time, but for the next few years when I saw him, whether he was with us, he was with the Kings for a while, the Rockets, the Lakers, I would always ask him, "Hey, Ron, have my lawyers called you yet?" And he would always laugh. I actually did consult an attorney, just not that I ever wanted to sue Ronnie, but I wanted to make sure that if I needed to, I was protected. For example, if I sustained some sort of injuries that were going to go on. Anyway, so I consulted a local attorney here in town who specialized in these types of things, and this is what he told me. He said, "You can sue him. I'll do it for you if you want, but you'll lose." I said, "How?" He said, "The video clearly shows that he didn't seek you out. You stood in front of him. That's on you. You're going to lose." And it's true. I did step in front of him. I blame myself. Now, Ronnie had well documented, especially in recent years, and I haven't seen the Netflix documentary yet, but I think they talk about it there. And I know Ronnie has spoken about it since. He had some issues, some serious issues, which he later went on to address. But by then he hadn't. And so people think he's a bad guy. And Gary, don't misunderstand. I'm not defending anything that happened that night. Under no circumstances can you go into the stands, although I understand why they did. But to this day, and that's 33 seasons, to this day, Ronnie's one of my all-time favorites. He's a genuinely nice man. He means well. He's got a big heart. Now, you talk to some of the guys on that team, and more than one of them have told me that he was an awful teammate. And I don't doubt that he was. He was mercurial. He was all over the map. And you could make the case that he cost those guys a championship. I get that. But he wasn't my teammate. He didn't cost me anything. I stayed in front of him. That's how I got the broken back. He was always nice. He was always friendly. He was always pleasant. And he was one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah. That had such an impact, obviously, on the team, on the city, on so many things. In hindsight, was that something that could have been tamped down or mitigated a little bit, or was it just a powder keg that was, really just needed a little spark to explode?
Well, it never should have happened, and it was an imperfect storm. And the one thing I always wondered about, we were up 15 or 16, less than a minute to go. Why were those guys even in the game? Didn't need to be. It was a physical, intense rivalry. It was a physical, intense game. The Pistons were embarrassed. They were getting spanked on their own floor. And so that was one. Number two, the officials two of the three officials handled it very poorly. The officials that night were Tim Donaghy, who later on was, as many know, disgraced because of gambling and other things. Ron Garrettson, a long-time NBA official who retired in the last 2 or 3 years. And Tommy Nunez, who's also retired now. Now, Tommy was the smallest guy there. And if you look at those videos, you'll see him right in the middle, right in front of us. He was the one guy that was trying to sort everything out. I don't know where Donaghy was. And Ron Garrettson was standing off to the side looking as though he was about to have his lunch money taken. And so he was useless. The officials could have done a better job of handling that. Those guys shouldn't have been out there in the first place. And then the third thing that came into play, it was a blowout. So the people in the lower deck had left. It was wide open. Security in the NBA then is not like it is now, in part because of that. So the people that were drinking up in the high seats came down to the low seats. They were fueled by alcohol. They were emboldened. And you saw what happened. It was nobody's fault, but it was a series, in my opinion, of circumstances that led to a powder keg. Everybody that participated, I think, shares some of the blame, some more than others. And in a nutshell, I say this. I don't defend any of those guys. I understand why they went up there. I get that. But you just can't do that. Any more than those fans should have come down on the floor.
Yeah.
The way I see it is this. If a fan comes down on the floor and gets drilled by a player, too bad. Too bad. You're where you don't belong. And the players don't belong in the stands either. It's just the way it is.
Yep. Mark, your relationship with Slick Leonard has been well documented. What I find interesting is how that relationship developed. He joined the broadcast, and it was in the 90s, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he was here when I got here. I got here in 88. He's been here since dinosaurs roamed the earth. So he was here. He'd done some television. I mean, he was a coach back in the 60s and 70s into the 80s, and then he got fired, and then he resurfaced as a broadcaster. In those days when Slick was on television, we weren't doing that many games on TV, but when we did, he was on there. And so he was around, and I got to know him a little bit. And I worked with Clark Kellogg my first year. And then Clark went over to television. And so I worked alone for the next several years, except in the playoffs. They would give me a guy in the playoffs. And so I had George McGinnis once. I had Billy Killer once. I had Slick once. I had Jerry Seasting once. I had, they gave me a guy. But we always got beat in the first round. So it was like 3 games, 5 games and out. Well, then the year that Larry Brown came, 93, 94, same thing. I worked alone. And then in the 94 postseason, they said, do you want a guy? I said, yeah, could I have Slick? Sure. Well, we had that long playoff run. We got all the way to game 7 of the conference finals. And people seemed to like what we were doing. I liked it. He liked it. And so then they suggested, why don't we pair you guys permanently? Which was fantastic. Until he had his second heart attack, he was with me all the time. And then after his second heart attack, he did home games.
Yeah.
And then in the last couple of years, once COVID hit, he operated from his house. We'd have him on for 3 or 4 minute segments in the pregame, halftime, and postgame. So he was with us in one form or another from 94 until he passed. In fact, he passed the day after we'd done a game together.
Yeah.
So we were together for almost 27 full seasons. And he was such a gracious man. And I've told this story before, and it reflects poorly on me. When they said, do you want Slick full time? Of course I wanted him. I loved the guy, and I knew what he could add to the broadcast, but I was still somewhat new. I think that was maybe my 6th or 7th year. I was still young. I was more full of myself than I am now. And I thought, yeah, I'll take this guy in. But man, he's popular, and he's not a real broadcaster. He goes off on tangents. He talks when he shouldn't. How's that? I'm as big an egomaniac as anyone. How's that going to affect me now? I thought it might actually hinder me. And instead, it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me, professionally. And that pales in comparison to what he's meant to me personally. His family has been so supportive. In fact, when I took this job and it wasn't stable, I was like the 5th guy in 5 years. So I never bought a house until I'd been here, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years. And Slick always told me the key to life, and this is oversimplification. He had a number of things he would share, but one of the things he always said was, you've got to own the ground you live on. That was one of his rules. So when I finally decided to buy a house, Slick's wife, Nancy, was my real estate agent, and Slick's son, Tom, built my house.
Okay. Yeah.
So, the Leonards have been a big part of my life. And Slick, well, I take great pride in my ability to use the language and to articulate and tell stories. I can't begin to describe, at least with the words that are at my command, how much this guy meant to me. He was just such a delight, such a gem, such a wonderful man. And the thing about him that resonates to me more than anything, he somehow had a knack for making everybody feel important. I don't know how he did it. I'm not a people guy myself, so I marveled at it all the time. He just had a way that made people feel like they were part of his inner circle, even though they might not have been. He was just a great people person and a wonderful ambassador for the franchise. And really, forget about sports, just in the context of people that have been important to Indianapolis and Indiana. He's in that conversation with, guys like Richard Lugar, guys from the business world. It's not just sports. He's had an impact on a variety of levels.
Yeah, you are so right. You are so right on that. Such a major impact on downtown Indianapolis and beyond. Mark, before we wrap up, I do want to get your thoughts on a couple things related to the game, the state of the NBA game now. How would you assess the state of the NBA game? We've got these super teams that are continually being formed. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for professional basketball?
Well, I don't look at it as a good thing or a bad thing. And if I did, I would say it's a good thing. Look at we've had different champions every year for the last several. So it's not like one team is dominating. Cleveland has won a championship. Miami has won a championship. You've had the Spurs in there. You've had the Lakers in there. I could go on, but you get my point. But I don't look at it as good or bad for the game. I look at it like this. Almost all of us are afforded the opportunity to work wherever we want, whenever we want. Players have less freedom than we do, but more than they've ever had before. Why shouldn't they orchestrate their own situation if the rules dictate it? The rules in the collective bargaining agreement have made this not just a possibility, but a relatively common occurrence. I think it generates conversation. Look at the free agency periods we've had the last 2 years. Guys changing teams, guys getting traded. It makes for off-season conversation. And as long as the same team isn't winning the championship every year, I think it's great for the game. Although, as I said, I don't look at it as better or worse. I just look at it as the way the league has evolved. These guys don't have the same privilege you do. And I know Joe Fan's going to say, yeah, well, I'm not making $8 million. I get that. But why shouldn't a professional, especially a top shelf professional, somebody that's one of the best in the world at what he does, why shouldn't he have the occasional opportunity to dictate his own fate? I see nothing wrong with that, really.
Yeah. A lot is made, Mark, of small market franchises in all professional leagues. Did the Bucks championship this year and a great run they had, did that give hope to small market teams, or do you think that was kind of an anomaly?
I don't think hope was needed. How many championships did the Spurs win? That's a small market. It still comes down to this. You have to have players. Now, the Bucks got their star through the draft. So did the Spurs. They got Tim Duncan through the draft. They got David Robinson before that through the draft. They got Ginobili through the draft. So these teams have constructed their teams in an intelligent fashion. You can win in a small market. It's harder. You don't have the resources. Your margin for error is different because you don't have the financial revenue streams. You can't make the same mistakes that the Knicks and Lakers have made over the years and hope to thrive. The Lakers, before James went there, they had a great storied past, but they had a period of 5 or 6 years where they were one of the worst run teams in the NBA. But it's Los Angeles. Now, if you're saying to me, well, free agents don't come to Indiana or Milwaukee, no, they don't. That's right. That's one of your disadvantages. And it's something you have to overcome. But it can be done, and it has been done.
Outlook for the Pacers this year. There's been a lot of change, obviously, in over the past number of years. What are your thoughts on this new version of the Indiana Pacers?
Well, it's a little premature to say because even though we're getting close to training camp, we don't know for sure who's going to be on the team. But for the sake of this conversation, let's just assume that it's going to be more or less the same team as has been here the last couple of years. 2 years ago, they had their preferred starting five for a total of 86 minutes all season, and they finished fourth in the East. Last year, with a rookie coach and difficult, turbulent times, they still made it into the play-in game with a variety of injuries. So I think there's reason to be optimistic. I don't want to be Pollyannish. I'm not suggesting this is a championship team. I don't think it is. But I think if everybody is healthy and they come back with the same team, and the everybody is healthy is definitely more than a passing statement because they haven't been for the last 2 years. Maybe they're injury prone. Maybe they won't be healthy. The one thing I can say with full confidence, and his track record backs this up, Gary, is this. Regardless of who's here, this coach will get the most out of this roster. So if these guys come back healthy, they're talented enough to be a top 4 team in the East, I think. But if they're hurt, well, then all bets are off. But I do feel confident that whatever is there, whatever combination of players, whatever health situations or injury circumstances evolve, I think this coach will get the absolute max out of whatever's there.
Certainly made headlines, and Rick Carlisle coming here. I think I tend to agree with you, Mark. Should be an interesting season as well. And we will be listening, of course, as always, Mark Boyle with Pacers, the voice of the Indiana Pacers, 33 years. Mark, really appreciate you taking the time to join us on the podcast. You're not only a great Hall of Fame broadcaster, interesting guy, and a guy who is near and dear to a lot of Indiana Pacers fans throughout the state. Thanks for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure. I've watched you guys for a number of years. I'm a big fan of not just what you do, but how you do it. It's obvious to me as a viewer that you take great pride in presenting all sides, in getting the facts. You're not just out there flapping your gums like some of these guys, and I appreciate you inviting me. It's been my pleasure.
I appreciate that, Mark, and appreciate all of you listening to this edition of the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. It's a weekly conversation with achievers in business, sports, entertainment, and beyond. And you can listen to all of our episodes and catch Indiana business news 24/7 at InsideIndianaBusiness.com. Thanks for joining us. I'm Gary Dick. We'll see you next time.